we're not going to talk about Outer Way because I don't think either of us are ready for that. It's too big. It's too important. It's one of those things I think where if it's too precious, you never approach it. It's too important for you, and for me there's just too much that I have to do to meet your standards of how far into the game you've become. So we both are treating it with kid gloves, and we're never going to get there. So at some point we're going to have to force ourselves. We're going to show up to a session and I'll say, okay, Lammy, Outer Wilds. We're doing it no matter, I don't care if you've played the DLC or not, we're doing it. But I've got another game, and I don't know, I know that you told me actually a little bit of how much you've played this game, but I, at the time, couldn't interpret it. I think I can now. Slay the Spire. This is a game that was released in 2019. It is a roguelike plus dungeon crawler plus deck builder. I want to get into those definitions in a little bit. I think those are important to unpack because roguelike and roguelite are new definitions for me. I've heard them a lot in literature. I've read them a lot, but I'm only now understanding just what they mean. Anyways, Slay the Spire apparently is all of these things. I've just barely gotten into it. It's a wonderful game and has some really interesting mechanics I'd like to dig into. And, at the core, it's just a fun game that can be played in a short span of time. It's one of those games you can jump onto and jump off of after 20 minutes. You might not want to jump off after 20 minutes because it's also very addictive. But Lammy, for someone who's played a lot of this game, by the sounds of it, why? What makes it so fun for you?
Oh man, I do love Slay the Spire. I think it's such a well-designed game. And I've mentioned it before, but I really love the roguelike and roguelite genres. And for me, it's the fact that, as I've said before, I'm very motivated by curiosity, exploration, and that sense of discovering something new. And with a roguelike or roguelite, it's often different synergies. And every single time you play, you're going to discover something new, usually, right? You're discovering a new way you can play when it comes to Slay the Spire. Often in other roguelites or roguelikes, you'll discover new synergies that you didn't know about. So it's like constant new content. And Slay the Spire specifically, of course, really kept me going as a completionist too, because I wanted to achieve everything that the game set out for me. So it was just the fact that every time with these games, when I lose, which we should get into the definitions of a roguelike, but when I lose, it always feels like it was under my control. And if I had just made that one choice differently, or in a mechanics-driven game, if I had just dodged a little better, I could have done it. I could have gotten further. I could have seen a bit more than last time. And that keeps me coming back.
So what are the parts of the game that you're wanting to explore? I mean, for me, there's all of these cards I haven't seen yet. All of these relics I haven't acquired yet. I think I've seen, well, I don't know. I've only been, I think, 3 levels in to a playthrough, so I don't know if there are monsters or enemies that I'm yet to encounter. But in terms of abilities and, of course, synergies, like you just mentioned, is that the core of what you're trying to discover? Or is it at all the world building, the story, the lore, which is very small? It's a very small part of it, but is that at all what you're looking for?
Oh, world building. I should have known the question would have come back to that. I should have known who I was talking to today. It didn't even cross my mind that would be something
it's
that
there.
You might get out of it.
It's in there. Anyways.
It is in there. And no, not at all what I was interested in. It's purely mechanical in nature, in seeing what are the different ways that I can build a deck so that I can be more efficient or use the relics better. Can I make this relic work that looks really situational if I get the right combination of things? It's really that strategy and tactic sort of thing, that kind of exploration of the mechanics in this case, in the case of Slay the Spire, that really keeps me coming back. And of course, using those mechanics to then get through the achievements and completeness and all of that. And also just, it feels good to play. I don't know if you found this, but Slay the Spire, they've done a really good sort of haptic, kinetic feel of it, of like actually dragging the cards and playing the game. It has sort of a meditative, easy flow state feel to it, that they've really captured. They've done a good job where like you're thinking really hard, but the actual act of playing the cards and choosing the cards and all that, but really playing them, I don't know, because you're attacking, right? So the game is a deck builder where all of your attacks and defense and everything is through the act of playing these cards, and that's how your character interacts with the enemies. But you get to a point when you're playing that card where you really like feel like you're attacking. They've done a good job with the animations and everything. So it feels good to play, and I wanted to discover all the sort of strategic things I can do with my deck.
You're totally right. When you play a card, it almost feels like you're physically grabbing it and slamming it on the table, and then it hits something. It has an effect. It does an activity or an action. There's a game I've played recently which is similar to Slay the Spire, if only because it can be played in short bursts. You can have an hour playthrough. I actually wrote about it in the newsletter I send out weekly, Slipways. And Slipways and Slay the Spire are similar because of the time in which you play them, but they're also similar in one other aspect, and this leads to my next question. The aspect is that it sounds like homework when you describe it to someone. If I'm going to describe playing Slay the Spire as you just described it, or Slipways to my wife or a non-gamer, it's going to sound like, why are you doing homework? Like, when you don't have to. Like, Slipways is where you're connecting different resources to one another, so this planet needs this and produces this, so you have to connect it with other planets that do the same thing, but your lines are only so long. It sounds like an engineer at the office doing work, drawing this all together. In Slay the Spire, obviously there's the very small component of the novelization of it, the storytelling, which is not important to me either. It's clearly not what this game is for. But there is a sense of, how do I make these cards work together? I've got 3 energy on this turn. I've got 5 different cards. One of them costs 0, one of them costs 2, but the one that costs 2 has a discard. And then if I use the discard, it activates this other card. And there's all this, well, you could call it play that's happening in there. But again, if I'm describing that coldly, taking away the sensitivity to it, taking away the, if I slam the card down, it has an effect or whatever, it's going to sound like work. So what makes games like this or Slipways or any other game like it successful as a game, as fun? Is it just what you described? Is it the tactility of it, or is there something more? Is the graphics, the cards, the colors on the screen, or is it something else that makes it fun for millions of people, because they've sold millions of copies of this game?
Yeah, Slay the Spire was sort of a sleeper hit. I think people didn't see it coming, and it was so successful. I don't think the developers saw it coming either. I think what makes it fun is the same thing that makes any puzzle fun for people. At the end of the day, people like puzzles, right? Whether it's a jigsaw, whether it's a Sudoku, whether it's a crossword puzzle, whether it's a video game puzzle. At least I know I do. And in the kinds of ways that you describe it as homework, to me reminds me of, why would somebody like playing puzzles? And some people don't get that, right? They're not into puzzles and they don't get it. But we've touched on this before, that one of the reasons I think you and I both like exploration and discovery is because what we actually like is those new connections in our brains being made. We like to expand our brains, and that feeling just feels good, right? I think it feels universally good for humans. It was probably a way for us to continue surviving as a species and learn and get better, selected for that way. But it feels good to learn something, or to have a hypothesis and to test it and find out you were right. I think there's like an inherent dopamine hit that you get with that, and I definitely feel it from these kinds of games. We've talked before about how I specifically enjoy efficiency puzzles as well. Like, I really like when you said, you have this much energy, what's the most efficient way to get the most out of it? Because maybe it's not even a puzzle game in the sense of there really is only one solution. It could just be a puzzle of optimizing, doing the best that you can with the resources you have. And the question of why is that fun, I think, is really a question probably more for biologists. But I'm sure that it's just something that we know inherently activates the dopamine in our brain and releases it. And not everyone feels that way about solving a puzzle, but I think that really it's learning, right? It's creating that new connection and being able to use what you've learned then later too, right? So when you've now, okay, I've consistently figured out that this card combination, you know, is consistent enough for me to rely on and use, you can use that and try to see, okay, if I have a little bit of that, does it work with this other card combination, or what else you could do? So it builds your knowledge. You're constantly seeing successes and learning and becoming better at this thing as you go, which always feels good.
Well, and that is, you've just identified, I think, the progression of Slay the Spire, which is a progression of your own skill, but also understanding of the game, understanding of the mechanics, understanding of what's yet to come, and experience with previous synergies and willingness to try new ones if you're in a different situation which you've never been in before. There's so many variables that no playthrough is going to be exactly the same. There's a question, though. You know, you and I have talked about being completionists before. So one aspect of this game is you're building your deck, similar to, say, Dominion, which is an actual board game deck builder. But at some point there becomes a need to get rid of cards, to discard cards, to get them out of your deck because they're clogging things up. I'm certainly not there yet, and the completionist in me is thinking, why would I ever get rid of a card? I'm just accumulating more. It's more power. And obviously I get to a hand where it's like a bunch of old, dumb strike cards that are so limited that it's obvious to me, but I can't. But it's this battle in my brain between the completionist and the optimizer. And if I was only told, Ben, keep about 20 cards in your hand, that's the ideal number, then I would aim for that. But because I have no aim, I've got no goal for that, I'm just blobbing out. So maybe you've encountered this problem, maybe you got over it a long time ago, but how does the completionist in you play that part of the game?
So maybe you're a bit early on in the game then, but you're in Slay the Spire. The deck building restarts every time. So is it a good time to go through some definitions? Do we need to?
I was actually thinking that because,
roguelike?
Yeah, because we're talking about, you mentioned the progression being your experience. What the progression is not is over the course of one person's existence in the game, one character, because permanent death is going to occur, and it's going to occur soon. You could sit down and an hour later, it's going to occur, and you didn't necessarily do badly. That's the point and thrust of the game. So yeah, with that in mind, or what is a roguelike?
So, and we might have already given a definition before, but Roguelikes and Roguelites were named after a game called Rogue that came out, I don't know if it was the 90s. I should probably know this because it is one of my more
it's actually 1980.
I was going to say it's either the 80s or the 90s, but I wasn't sure when it came out. I was like, yeah, I don't think it was the 70s, but close. And it's this idea. I mean, they were typically, I believe, Rogue was a dungeon crawler in its original sense, and the progression was so auto-generated. So each time you played, the map would change, and the encounters would be randomized, and essentially every time that you perished, you would start over and everything would be completely randomized again. So it was more like a sandbox that you'd be put through with random elements within a sort of, there was always going to be, the game was going to be, let's say a dungeon crawler with certain elements that switched up all the time. Let's say the map or the items and things like that. And you progress, and the idea is in Roguelikes that every time you start over, it is exactly the same as the first time you played. The only real difference is your own knowledge and skill at the game. So games, there's a lot of games that follow this sort of pattern where, you either die or you can succeed. So just to go into more terminology, usually we call every time you play and you start over, we call that a run. So anytime you start a new run, you might win the run, whatever that means for the game. Winning for some games might be dying, but getting to the end or whatever that might be, but there might be some sort of success. And usually if you don't win the run, it means you end early before you've seen all of the content or all of the levels or getting a completion screen. And in true roguelikes, I believe the difference between roguelikes and roguelites is that in roguelites, There might be an overlayer of progression that happens. So maybe you collect some sort of currency that you can spend outside and slowly improve yourself, so that it's not just your own skill and knowledge that improves, but actually your character can get stronger, or you can change things about the game. Whereas kind of true roguelikes, nope, every time you start, it's essentially the exact same as when you first started. So Slay the Spire, as I would say, even though technically as you play, you do start unlocking a few cards, the cards aren't necessarily easier or better or more helpful. So the game isn't actually necessarily getting easier. And in fact, there are ways to unlock harder modes as you complete versions of the game and you complete runs. So maybe some purists would call it a roguelite because it's not perfectly exactly the same from the first time you play it to the 150th. But I would say in spirit, it's still pretty much a roguelike in that you're not actually buying upgrades. You're not slowly accumulating just by brute force playing it. You're not slowly actually getting better. An example of roguelites is the very, very famous Rogue Legacy. Obviously, clearly got its inspiration from Rogue as well, where it did have, and it does have, this coin system where every time you die, well, every enemy you kill and every, kind of barrel you break might give you some coins, and you can spend that to upgrade your actual town and therefore get stronger each time. So that's a very common way to play these games because roguelikes are notoriously really, really difficult. That's another thing I would say is very common in them because you're supposed to die. You're supposed to die a lot and quickly. And in fact, the runs only get to about an hour long usually once you get good enough at them to sort of survive long enough and make it that far. So that's kind of the way that these games play is you're thrust in at first. Usually they also don't describe a lot to you. You're supposed to just figure it out because they want you to get over the fear of death. They don't want you to be worried about dying and retrying. It's trying, I think, to train that idea that no, this is the loop. The loop of the runs are you start and you try things out and they might work, they might not. And even if they don't work, it might not have been your fault. You could have been totally on a good path and just gotten unlucky, and that's just the way it is. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try again. And the roguelites sort of help that difficulty by providing some sort of, let's say, additional help to people who maybe, don't have the time to dedicate to necessarily get really, really, really good at the game, but can just play casually and slowly increase the power of their character over time. I don't remember what the original question was, but I did give the
No, you did it.
Oh,
the original,
definitions.
The definitions. I think one way to actually, a good example of a roguelite would be the film The Edge of Tomorrow, where Tom Cruise dies but comes back with memories of what he just did and he gets to try again and again and again. It's not procedurally generated. It's the same world, but you get the idea. No, that was a great definition. I think that's perfect. I looked this up before we started chatting, and I think you've nailed it. I've not played a lot of games like this, but it's familiar both in games but also in literature. This idea of coming to an end, but the end is not. But you've gained something still. You've either gained something in terms of your own progression or something deeper. In a way, getting achievements on Steam is a form of a roguelite game. There is a progression in spite of everything. You're still gaining something even after 100 runs of a game, which might take 8 hours each, which were all failures in one way or another. You're still accumulating something, or just maybe you're just accumulating number of hours played, which you can show off to other people. That's the roguelite aspect, maybe. There's a really powerful tension in this game between randomness and predictability. A lot of the game is randomized, which cards you're, it's a deck builder game. So like a deck of cards, there's going to be an element of chance here. But unlike a lot of card games, chance does not determine the outcome, obviously. There's also no, as you said, no right answer like a puzzle might have. There's many different answers because you might do the best combination you could possibly do in this one hand, getting the right answer. But the next turn, you might be completely screwed because you used up all the cards that took away from the possibilities now. And like me, you have now 5 attacks or 5 defends and you're just done. Or whatever the combination gets you into. And so there's the randomness, but there's also the predictability. The things you gain by playing over and over again is the sense of understanding what can be yet to come. The same deck is present every single playthrough. The same relics, or you might not see all the same cards. You might not see the same relics you saw last time, but you know that they're there, and you can generally predict what you're going to do. There's also a predictability of the kinds of enemies you're going to face and what kinds of things they're going to do. Predictability, too, in terms of you're facing a monster, you know that they're going to alternate between attack and buff, or attack and give you a negative effect, or something like that. And so there's a sense that these two are in tension, and I think the designers of this game succeeded in getting that tension right. Yeah, what do you think about this between randomness and predictability? Is that something you've thought about before? Is that something you're thinking about when you're playing it? Or, yeah.
Definitely. It reminds me a lot of... I actually think about this quite a bit, and I think about it with board games as well. But it reminds me a lot of really good, let's say, poker players. We know, or even blackjack, right? And blackjack sort of less so, but because it's really a numbers game and a statistics game. But you take something like poker, and yes, it's, at the end of the day, it's random chance who has the highest card. And yet, good poker players always beat bad poker players. It's, you can say that, well, how does that make sense? It should just be sort of random chance, as long as the people are equal, understand the statistics of the game, it should be kind of equal. But no, there is an aspect of skill and of strategy and of knowing how to pick. So, knowing what cards to change and when to bet, and all of those things matter. And I've actually wondered this with certain board games. As a person who's a bit of a math nerd, I sometimes wonder to what extent games do actually leave it in your hands, and to what extent even a popular board game, if you actually look at the statistics of winners across, hundreds of thousands of people, would there actually be a correlation to skill in any way, or is it totally random chance? And you know what? I have to give it to game makers, because most of the time, even when I really want to believe that, just because Artie always wins games, it's just random and it's not my fault that I lose all the time. No, it's true. I think there is something to be said for strategy, and these kind of deck builder games especially. I have seen, and I have watched quite a few people on Twitch play Slay the Spire especially. You get the same kind of thing with Hearthstone or those kinds of games. And even though it's random chance, and more so with Slay the Spire because the deck starts the same every time. You didn't build your own deck like in Hearthstone. It seems to be like the best players know how to make gold out of nothing, right? They know how to make something out of nothing. And they will always, even in the worst situations, usually a good player on the easier difficulties will win every time. Like, it doesn't matter that they got handed the worst choices and the worst cards and the worst relics. They will always put themselves in the best position to succeed. And that is what the skill gives you as you play. So as much as there is a randomness aspect, we've talked about this aspect before too, which is that what makes a game fun is choice, and the player's choice mattering. And I think you can have randomness, which often will make you feel bad in a game and feel like, oh, then my choice doesn't matter. But you can mix it really well with player choice. And Slay the Spire is such a great example of how you can mix RNG, essentially, and player choice together and still get a really great game where your choices do matter and do lead to you winning more often.
Yeah, it's funny when you mention board games. This is it feels like again, it's not just the tactility of it, but the way the game is designed feels like it could easily be a board game or a game of Magic the Gathering, where you sit around with some friends and you get some cards together, and there's always the hope that when you draw a card, you're going to get that great one that's going to beat everybody else. But it doesn't matter if you're up against someone who knows what they're doing and you don't. It's the classic line in poker: if you're at a table and you don't know who the sucker is, it's you. And it doesn't matter that you get the best hand. Like, I have not played a lot of poker, but I played a little bit about a year ago. I was in a cast of a play and we were on tour and we played a bit of poker, and I really enjoyed it because I was looking into the game mechanics of it and how does this work, and I'm going to bluff. I'm totally going to bluff this. And it was obvious to the guy who brought the poker deck that what I was doing and what everyone else was doing, and he cleaned up. He didn't have any good hands. I don't think there was one time where he had a hand that was better than my best 2 or 3 hands. Like, I had some good hands, and he cleaned me out. He cleaned everybody out. Obviously, that's playing over a length of time. I think we played multiple times, maybe a total of 4 or 5 hours total. Many, many hands going around. And I wonder with poker, if you were to reduce the amount of information you get from the game, if you didn't know that other people, how they were betting, what they were betting on, when they were folding and all that stuff, I wonder if you would do better because you would simply pay attention to the quality of your cards. Would a computer do better at poker if it didn't have to manage all of the information coming at it? But of course, you get the information of someone bluffing or you think they're bluffing. You naturally respond to that. Even if you don't respond to it, you react to it. And I think that's a wonderful aspect of the game. If it didn't involve money, I would probably play a lot more. But I'm too scared. I'm too conservative. I don't want to lose all my money to people who are better at playing this than me, which is obviously what would happen. I was going to ask you about the time limit to this game. You can sit down, like you said, for an hour, although it seems to me that if you're playing 20 levels, it would take a lot longer than an hour. But I watched a bit of YouTube people playing, and they were so fast. I couldn't believe, I couldn't believe how quickly. How did they even look at your deck? You didn't even know what's there. It comes out and you already know what to do. I couldn't believe it. Anyways, yeah, when you sit down to play, is it something that you can do when you have 15 minutes here or there, or is it something you sit down and I'm playing Slay the Spire?
Yeah, I think for me with roguelikes, and like I said, I have played quite a few. It really started with The Binding of Isaac, which I brought up before. Fantastic game, got me into, I guess technically I played Rogue Legacy before Binding of Isaac, but I didn't really know what roguelikes were at the time. I thought it was just a little, adventure-y game. And I find with all roguelikes for me that I cannot interrupt a run halfway through. I can, but when I come back, I'm going to die. Undoubtedly, within a few minutes of starting the run again. There's something about when you're in a run, you're building it and you're holding all that information in your head about what you were trying to achieve. What were you going for? What were the synergies? What was the deck that you were trying to build? Whatever that might be. And I find that whenever I stop a run partway through and try to come back to it, even sometimes if it's something as simple as having to run to the washroom, I'll just, although that usually won't harm it as much, but if I pause, leave the game and come back hours later, days later, I'm probably going to die immediately. I just can't maintain, it's almost like there's a learning curve that happens even within any one run. And so I can pick it up to just play one run. That can happen. But it's very rare that I would ever give myself less time than that. And depending on the game, run lengths can be different. I'm a pretty, for the most part, I've been a pretty methodical player, and I'll take longer. That completionist side of me, I want to squeeze every bit of efficiency and optimization out of any run. So I'll tend to be more exploratory and looking more deeply into, let's say I'm thinking of The Binding of Isaac right now, which is a dungeon crawler. You can win, and in fact, they might be more advantageous to play quickly and not explore every single room in some ways, because there are some benefits to going fast in that game. But I'm the kind of player that I want to see every room, because who knows what game-breaking thing might be behind that next door that I haven't looked at. And so I tend to take a bit longer to play. But I have actually, as I've gotten more confident with the games, I have tried to push myself to play a bit faster. But usually that'll mean I make sure I have half an hour if I try to play fast for any roguelike, but usually at least an hour. And often I'll give myself enough time to play 2 or 3 runs. We've talked about that before, that usually I won't go past the 3-hour play session of anything. So that's still the way that I play things. There are some, and roguelikes for sure are more commonly one that I'll pick up just to play one run and then put down, much more so than other kinds of games where you might be locked in for whatever reason into a longer play session. I find I can definitely pick those up, and especially the ones that feel good to play and you can kind of flow state. Like you said, people were playing so fast you couldn't believe it. But trust me, as you learn the cards, you won't have to think. And the thing that I wanted to get at earlier about skill and about the fact that even though there's random chance, deck builders, which we didn't actually talk about what a deck builder is, but in a deck builder, essentially, usually you are presented with options of cards to add to a deck that you'll be drawing from each each time you sort of play around. So you have a deck of cards. Usually everybody, the point will be if you're playing against other players or whatever it might be, gets the same sort of start, but you are presented cards to choose from. And as you add cards to your deck, of course, now when you're drawing cards, different synergies will happen because you have different potential cards that you're drawing from. And so it's the deck building aspect that people have very differing skills at. That's what you get better at. You get better at learning these are good cards to add, these are bad cards to add, or these are good cards to add, but only in this case because of the other things I added. Or this is a good time to stop adding cards and start removing cards. We were talking about that earlier. That's the part of the game that you get much better at, the deck building aspect of it. And I think when you've kept all that information very much in your brain, like I was saying, you kind of have it in that working memory, it's really easy. You know exactly where you're going to draw because you planned it. As much as we say it's RNG, if you've done a good job of building your deck, there shouldn't be anything surprising when you're drawing a hand. There should only be a permutation of a couple different ways it could go, so it should be really easy to just play your hand without having to think too much once you get really good at it. And you could definitely get flow state and a quick run that just feels good to play and, you know, gets you a little bit of that dopamine rush.
Yeah, a good corollary, at least for me, is just basic card games. You know, when I'm playing Hearts, and I've been playing for like an afternoon on a rainy day at a cottage with family or something, I get really fast. And, you know, someone who hasn't been playing the game might look over my shoulder and they would say, how did you know? Like I would organize my hand in like a few seconds, put it down, and I know what's in there and I can go. And I'm interested in still playing. It's not like I'm bored by this. And of course, part of the aspect of playing cards is the communal nature of it. You're sitting in a circle, you're chatting between your moves or whatever. And like Axis and Allies is a fun game, even though it takes 10 hours to play. You spend a whole day doing it because when someone's doing the turn, everyone else is still chatting, you know. But with cards, you can be incredibly fast, and I'm still looking forward to, okay, this is the time I'm going to play that card. I'm going to go for broke in this round or whatever. Another thing you mentioned that I found interesting was wondering what's behind every door, and you want to get everything because there might be something there. My first ever playthrough of Slay the Spire, I picked a path, started going through, and then was like, wait a minute, I can't go on these other paths? That's BS. I want to see what's behind that one. Quick question for you. When you are going up to the top of the spire, do you click, if you have a line of question marks, do you go through that, or would you rather go through encounters?
I was laughing at that because the truth is that, and it's such a funny psychology thing for me, but man, I always want the question marks because I don't know what they are. They could be anything, even a fight. You know, it's just, it's true. I'm so motivated by that question mark.
Yeah,
it could be anything. It's just so silly.
I know what the encounter is going to be. It's going to be a fight and then a new card at the end. I know it. It's defined. Mm-hmm. And the indefinable is much more interesting, even if it's going to be bad for me. Even if I'm going to get cursed and get nothing by it and get no new cards, I still want to know.
Okay, that is one place that I will say that the lore and the story is actually something I'm looking for. I find in Slay the Spire and in games that have since copied a lot of what Slay the Spire has done well, those question mark events are actually the most fun lore. That's where you get the funny characters that, you know, either give you a boon or a curse or something. And I've actually really enjoyed, so the overall story or the characters, like the actual player character, I'm not that interested in. But in the question marks, I am really interested in the encounters. And in fact, one of the things that I like is that often those question marks will have a little bit of a story element, little spice, something thrown in, and I really like to see that, especially because there's quite a few. You might not always, you know, there's often, you have to play for a while to really experience all of the different events, and I do enjoy the story aspects of those, and which I didn't even think of, because I don't tie them into anything really that much grander, but it is fun to see that little bit of writing in there that is almost just for fluff, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the event will do something that affects your playthrough, but there's that added nice bit of, oh yeah, this isn't a fight, therefore I can get something else out of it, because it's not an encounter where I have to fight. I'm getting another, now I can focus on a story, now I can focus on other kinds of information.
Yeah, it's a complete tangent, but just for a moment, I'm thinking of not just games like this, but, and I've got to mention it every time, Paradox games. But if you think of a Paradox game, there is story in there, but usually the story has a series of points in the plot, and then a set of things you can choose. Accept, reject, do a third option or whatever, and each of those you can see immediately what effect they're going to have. So most people don't read the story, they don't read the choices, they just look for the effects. They're playing it like they play Slay the Spire. And I wonder if that's one way, and this is just me wondering, if you want to focus on story and you want people to engage in the story, then don't tell them what the effects are going to be, right? And then they'll actually read it and think about it, and you know, obviously you're going to be tricked once in a while, but if generally you understand what's going on, you might have a better chance of predicting the outcome of choosing B instead of C or whatever. Anyways, that's a tangent. Question for you about your own playing of this game. You said you've done an Ascension 20 run. Did you win?
Oh yes, I've won multiple. I can't remember now if I've won with every character. They definitely have released at least one new character since I had gone through, so I don't think I've won with one of the newer characters for sure.
Which is your favorite character to play with?
Ooh, I really like the Silent. Which is interesting, by the way, because the Silent is female, canonically. And I there was a bit of me that wondered, but also they're green. Green is my favorite color. That's probably why I liked them. Like, you know, I really like the Silent. Who's your favorite?
I would say the Silent as well, but only because I find I can get the furthest with it. I think I'm going to do well as Ironclad. It's also the first character you play as when you first start the game, because you have a lot more hit points, and it seems more basic. I'm just hack and slash, and I can recover hit points at the end of every encounter. But I don't seem to do as well as the Silent, who just has so many options to optimize a hand. There just seems to be things you can do, attack and defense, using poison, for example. The things you can do with poison. You poison a character, you can triple the poison, and if you're smart with it, in 3 rounds, the poison has killed everybody, and all you've done is defend yourself. And so there's also something about maybe the character of the Silent, which is this sort of rogue, you know, of course, in a roguelike, but this, you know, silently moving up the spire, being tricky, and rather than just coming out and just bashing people over the head. I don't think I've ever played as the third one. It's unlocked for me now, but I don't, the reject or the defect or something. And then the fourth character is still unlocked for me, so I don't even know what that is. But yeah, so if you've beat the game, what brings you back? Is it just the searching for synergy that brings you back to play more?
I definitely didn't, like, once I beat Ascension 20, that was the main.
So what does that mean?
Driver.
Sorry, what does Ascension 20 mean?
So as you play the game, when you beat it, at some point you will unlock the ability to make the game more difficult. So each level of Ascension makes the game difficult in a way. They'll tell you, right? Like, oh, and enemies have more health, or you know, the what are the harder bosses? Like, the bosses are harder.
The elites.
The elites, thank you. Yeah. The elites might be harder, and it's kind of cool actually, because sometimes, like, elites will have new move sets, which is fun because you get to experience some different things. But yeah, it gets harder. It gets harder and harder, and in fact, like with the Ascension going up, it's all of those things. So each level, you know, level 3 has all the things from level 1, 2, and 3. So it gets harder and harder to beat. So for me, of course, it was just the fact that we talked about the fact that in Slay the Spire, it's not really a roguelite, in that you're not doing anything outside of the game to make the game easier for you. You're just having to get better, but you are getting better at a pace. Like, as you get better, the game gets harder, so it's still evergreen, and you're still trying to beat that new challenge. But it's true that once I kind of got and beat the hardest level that they had at the time, who knows if they've updated it since, there was less of an incentive for me to play. However, they did add in daily challenges, which are fun. So dailies have a preset that they start with, like a preset character, and essentially everybody starts playing the same seed. So the seed of the game is what gives it its unique characteristics, like the way the map is, you know, laid out, and what elites are where, and what the bosses are going to be. And I mean, there are still some things that can affect the choices available, because as you said, not everybody takes the same path down, up the spire. So even if you're presented with the same seed, you could have totally different experiences. But for dailies, everybody essentially competes against each other with the same seed, and that changes every day. So that's one way to keep the game interesting. And I do really enjoy dailies. Dailies tend to be way easier than the Ascension runs because they're not at that Ascension difficulty level. But then it's more about really optimizing. So I come back to see, what's today's and how well can I do, because you get a score compared to my friends or the general public, and that's still fun. Now, I haven't played in a while, but I had a lot of hours in that game. I haven't checked, but I have to say it's probably over 200 hours. Like, I don't know. I've put a lot of hours in that game to be able to beat Ascension 20 with, I think, 3 characters. At least 2. I'm pretty sure I've beaten it with Silent and Ironclad. Probably the Defect as well, but I can't quite remember. I'll have to check.
One more comment about that game, about Slay the Spire, from me, is something I learned. I watched the GDC talk that one of the co-founders of Mega Crit Games, which is the company behind Slay the Spire, Anthony Giovanetti, he did a talk at the Game Developers Conference, and he talked about a lot of things, but one thing he mentioned, which is that there are things in this game that are overpowered, not too overpowered, not completely out of whack, but that's okay because it's single player. Mm-hmm. That in a multiplayer experience, they would have to tone that down. And it made me think a lot about designing single player versus multiplayer. Quick aside, when I play Dungeons and Dragons, when I'm a dungeon master, I have less problem with anything being overpowered, so long as it doesn't happen every 5 minutes, and so long as everyone has a chance to have the same moment of being overpowered. If someone is really smart with their character design and they create a character that's overpowered based on the rules, I might balance that. But that's okay. That's on me as a DM to make everybody else overpowered at the same time in a different way, or give them a chance to be not equally, but similarly overpowered. And therefore, it's no longer overpowered because the floor has been raised. But it's interesting to me because you don't face the same constraints in a single-player game. And that one moment might be so exciting. Oh, I want that to happen again. I want that card back, and I want that card to be paired with this card. One example is the setup card and the bomb, which the Silent can get. For me, I don't think that's necessarily overpowered. I'm way too early to say anything is overpowered, but for me, it's like, I love that. Yes, I love it when that happens. Okay, so to close this out, Lammy, we talked about a lot in terms of Slay the Spire. If there's one thing that we missed, one thing that you want to dig further into, or just something else you'd like to talk about, what would that one thing be for next time? And don't say Outer Wilds. We'll get there.
I think we have so much more to talk about when it comes to Slay the Spire. I love this game. I'm so glad you're getting into it. I think we should keep talking about it next time. There's a lot of things. I've literally been making notes of more things I want to talk about. And I think it digs into that. Like, let's talk about balancing games, because roguelikes are a great and interesting version of having to balance a game as a developer, and where is that balance? And I think we could dig deeper into that. And talking about getting overpowered, there were still questions I really wanted to ask you.
Like what?
Whether you prefer whether you think that it matters whether it's a roguelike or a roguelite, and whether you prefer one to the other. But you might not know the answer to that yet. I might have to point you towards some more roguelikes and roguelites so you get a feel for which one you might prefer.
I probably don't know the answer, and I bet you that the answer is the opposite of what I think it would be, right? Like, I'd say, oh, of course I'd prefer a roguelite because I want to get something for all of my work. But that's probably exactly the thing that's standing in the way of me enjoying it, right? The fact that I start over with nothing but my own experience and learning is what makes it appealing, is what makes me want to come back to it, and what makes it evergreen, like you said.
I thought you said we weren't going to talk about Outer Wilds today.
Hey, I didn't say it. You did. Okay, that's a good place to start next time. Lammy, thank you so much. This was a great chat.
Thank you.